All right. So just the questions that were on the assignment. The first one was, why did Hurston choose to incorporate folklore into her story? I think just like all of the other books that we've read so far, the use of folklore kind of like allows people to understand the story better because they have like a parallel. Sometimes it's like something really well known like Cinderella, or sometimes it could be like something less less like widely known, but I just think that it helps to push the story along, just like all the other books we've read so far.
Yeah, I think it makes it more interesting to read rather than it's like, I don't know, biography or something. It just kind of makes it more like fun and enjoyable.
Yeah, I also think it kind of helps bring some information or kind of background into different cultures. Like in this book, I feel like there were some different cultural things that were talked about as she kind of didn't know where she fit in and was trying to figure that out. So I think it just kind of helped with a little bit of cultural background.
Yeah, I agree. The next question is just about like why, or like how does African American tradition function in Their Eyes Were Watching God? And I think that kind of relates back to the first question where like the use of folklore, especially in the African American community, is really big, and it's like a very like large and important part of their culture. And so because Janie, like the protagonist, was like African American, like there was like an African American community. It just kind of like set the tone of the book, and how Jeannie and like her husbands were perceived throughout the story.
Yeah, I think it plays kind of like a historical role and kind of like bringing in what it was like, and kind of understanding like how it was different for like African Americans versus whites or like other races, and just giving us kind of an idea of like what their traditions were and what they valued and stuff.
Yeah, I think because Janie kind of was on both sides. Like when she was really young, she didn't realize she was colored, just because of who she was around. And then we kind of got to see the side where like she lived in a more African American community, and seeing how those traditions kind of affected her and affected her outlook on life, and how she perceived herself and how those people perceived her. And then I also think like it was good to see both sides of like how sometimes they were judgmental towards her and sometimes they weren't, and things like that. So
the next question is, what do you think are the audience and purpose of Their Eyes Were Watching God? I don't know. I don't know if this is a book that like, if it wasn't for an assignment, that I would read myself. It just like, I really did enjoy it, but it wasn't like a book that like is usually in my like genre of like the stuff I like to read. But it was interesting from like a historical standpoint, and I liked how the book was described in like the pre-reading assignment. The book was described as like a very like feminist novel, even though it talked a lot about like the patriarchy and like the racial structure of society. It was it was named more of like a feminist book, which is pretty cool because I would like to consider myself a feminist. So I feel like the audience, it kind of caters to like a more broad audience because it incorporates a lot of it's like a lot of different attributes that makes the book more like universally not acceptable, but like universally like more people would read it instead of like a narrow demographic.
Yeah, I think that I think that really anybody could read it. I really struggled with the way it was written and like reading it in that type of language. It was so hard for me because I just wanted to like change it to proper English. But as I got like into the book, I was like, okay, like I can do this. And so I think that like for me, it kind of changed my perspective about like what it was like to live during that time period, and that it wasn't anything like the time we live in now. So I think that it was just like bringing awareness of that to people who, I mean, don't have any idea or are more curious or stuff like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. It was difficult to read. It was very difficult to read at some points, but I feel like having it written like that kind of helped with getting in that mindset and getting like in the setting. I'd like read it in an accent or whatever. I mean, I feel like that's the point of it is so you read it in a different way. But I think the audience maybe like it's kind of broad in general, but I also think it could be geared towards women and kind of how it goes through how we are like how women are seen and how that needs or it's starting to evolve and how for Janie how a woman like how she perceived a woman that changed throughout the story. So
I like that. I didn't really think of it as like until you said something about how like reading it in the way it was written kind of like helps put you in that perspective. I really liked that because there were some times where I had to like try and read it like out loud to myself to understand what was being said. So that's like a really cool observation. The next question is just like what societal attitudes, values, or ideals are conveyed or challenged in this book. I think that in general, kind of like the patriarchy was like a big, like an overshadowing of the book, and just like how anyone who isn't, who like doesn't fit that like very narrow description of like who belongs in the patriarchy or like who is like who conforms to like those societal standards is like an outcast. I thought that was something I noticed a lot in the book. Like how each of her husbands were kind of like they were different and like the way that they were perceived by others also at that time kind of like helped or not like help people, but that was also the way that Jamie was perceived, even though she was the same, like essentially the same person each time, like depending on who she was with, changed like how she was treated.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting how, like we've kind of mentioned earlier, that it was more of like a feminist book and like living your own life. And I thought that was really interesting for the time period that it was set in because, like you said, it was all patriarchy and like you belong to your husband. And we saw with the first two husbands that they pretty much just owned her and were like, "You're gonna do what I ask you to do." I think that it was interesting reading it like now and being like seeing how far we've come and like what changes have been made and like still what problems we still see. Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting.
yeah, I definitely think it's kind kind of behind feminism and a woman's role in a marriage, and how it kind of evolves from where she's first like she's more treated like she's expected to do all the work and or all this stuff, and then in the next marriage with Joe, she's expected to be like a trophy wife and just look good but not too good. And then in the last with Tea Cake, she was kind of able to find that balance of equality within the marriage, where they shared things and there was a balance there, which I think was really progressive for the time. And so that's kind of cool that, like, even though this was based way back when, that like it was progressive for that time, and like how far we've come.
The next question: in what ways does Hurston make African American tradition relevant for contemporary readers? I think she uses it as kind of like a framing device. It does help you like to kind of like what Jerica said, to like put yourself in like Janie's shoes, or like in the time period, like in the setting of the story. It helps you just to have like another perspective of how it was back then. Like kind of like a way Kirsten used it in a way to like make it more like relatable to the audience.
Yeah, and I think like we've talked about, is it kind of like things in our life and like issues that we see, and like made it like put them in the book. So then it was like, it wasn't crazy to see it and be like, oh, like he's like forced to be a housewife, or like she's forced to be a trophy wife. It wasn't like this big crazy idea that we were reading about. It was something that was super relatable, and like we can understand and be like, oh yeah, like some people think that like women should only be in the home and they should make dinner for their husbands every night and stay in the house and, you know, do all of the work or whatever. So yeah, I think Kristen just did a really good job of like applying it in a way that didn't seem so distant from us.
Yeah, I think that the way that they or she included the different African American traditions, and then how we can relate to today. There's this part in the book, I wrote it down in my notes. I don't even know if this answers the question, but I just thought it was interesting that like at one point when Janie was with Tea Cakes, they finally felt comfortable to, it says like, to dance in front of the Americans, or like invite American friends over to dance with them, and they'd have like dance parties. But it took them a while to get that to that point, because they thought that they'd get made fun of or laughed at by the Americans. And I feel like dancing is a pretty big part, a pretty big tradition for African Americans, or it's just like a big part of their culture and their lives. And so the fact that they were afraid to kind of like do that in front of certain people is kind of relatable to like anyone nowadays. Like we're afraid to go out with a certain hairstyle or a certain like outfit on, because we're scared of like how people are gonna see us. But really, like, chances are you'll be fine. Like they won't laugh at you or whatever. So
I like that a lot. I would never have thought to like relate that back to like our own lives, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Because I sometimes do that. Like I like want to like wear something that I think is really cute, and then I like put it on and I go out and like I don't like put my thinking about that. So I like that a lot. All right, the last two questions are kind of related. How does race affect the relationships of the characters in the novel? Or like gender or class. It doesn't have to be just race. And it says give specific examples. I don't remember like the page numbers for the specific examples, but just like through her marriage, like kind of just like less than a human, where she like does all of the housework and everything, and then she progresses and kind of like takes a step up, and now she's seen as like she is seen as a wife and like a human, but she really is only there as like, you know, a like a I don't know, like a purse or like something that you like. I can't even think of the word right now. It's with an A, but it's like just something you bring with you. Like it's she's not really like a real person. And then in like her last relationship with Tea Cake, she still deals with a lot of that struggle, but she kind of like realizes who she is and has more. She becomes more of like a person than she was in her last two relationships, and so I think that that has a lot to do with her gender, just because she is a woman. Like, and that's like they had a very specific role in their relationships and in their society. So I think that is like one of the most evident pieces.
I was thinking about in the very beginning of the book when they take the picture and she realizes that she's colored and she doesn't look like all the rest of the kids. And all the rest of the kids are like, what? Like, they kind of make fun of her a little bit for not realizing that. I just thought like the difference between them and her and like their class status or like their socioeconomic status, because I mean, obviously her grandma didn't make as much money like being a housemaid and stuff, but I also thought about the class thing of like when she was married to Joe and like he was seen as like above everybody else, even though they were all like it was an African American community and it was supposed to be like this great thing. He was still like, oh yeah, like I'm better than you, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, all of those things are, I mean, that covers pretty much like the gender and the class and race. And I feel like this book focused a lot on gender and how I think this could answer both the first and second question. But when Janie was like arranged to be married with, I can't remember his Logan, that's his name, Logan, the first husband. She thought she had this idea of like what love was and like what she should expect, and then she kind of realized that like she was treated differently because she was a woman even in that relationship, and she didn't like how she was treated, and then it kind of changed her relationship with Logan. It didn't really go anywhere because of the way he treated her and how she felt around him. She felt like she couldn't be herself. And I think that has a lot to do with because she was a woman and because during that time, that's just how women were treated. And so that definitely affected that relationship. And it influenced the way she looked at the world for a little while after that, because she thought she had this idea of what marriage was, and then it kind of changed. And so, yeah, I think that definitely affected her moving on.
Yeah, when you were saying that, I was thinking back to I don't remember if it was second or third marriage, but they were like, he's way darker than you. Like, how can you marry him? And so it was still like, even within their race, they were like, no, he's so much darker than you. You can't marry him. And I was like, what? It doesn't even make sense. So I just thought it was weird. Like, everything she did was wrong. And it was like because she was a woman or because her hair was super pretty or because she was lighter than the rest of them, or like all of these things, and none of it was her fault. So
I like that a lot, and I feel like that leads really nicely into the next question of like just talking about when did two or more of the factors above come together to influence how the character treated. And I think that like you're right, like the whole book, Jamie was like, no matter what she did, it was never like the right thing to do, and it was because of she was a woman, or like because she was in like a lower class than, or like seen as in a lower class than other people. And I think that I really liked the quote at the very end of the book, like the last couple sentences, when she kind of like acknowledges that tea cake is like he's dead, like physically he's dead, but it says like, well, of course he wasn't dead. He could never be dead until she herself had finished feeling and thinking. The kiss of his memory made pictures of love and light against the wall. Here was peace. And I like that just the diction in general of that quote is like very like calming, and it kind of like just reinforces that yeah, she is coming to terms with it, and she is finally in control of something in her life. Like just because he's physically dead, like it doesn't mean that like he's gone forever. Because like it said, he'd never be dead until she'd finished feeling and thinking. And so that's something that she has control over, that no one else can like tell her it's wrong because of who she is. So I thought that was like a very cool like coming to terms with it, or like even though it is at the end and it's kind of like the conclusion of the book, I think that's like to me that almost seemed like the climax of it, where she finally like realizes that like she is in control, because this whole time she's felt like I thought that was really cool. And that was like it was my favorite part of like quote in the book.
yeah, I really like that too.
So if anyone else has any last things to add about like
I'll just add kind of a quote from like what I was talking about earlier, and how Logan kind of, or her first marriage, just in general, kind of like changed her outlook on love. And it said, she knew now that marriage did not make love. Janie's first dream was dead, so she became a woman. And I think that quote really like stuck out to me, because it kind of like foreshadowed, I don't know if it foreshadowed, but it kind of like set the tone for the rest of the book. And you kind of knew that like it wasn't going to be an easy journey for her, and she wasn't going to like always feel like a woman, or always feel like her dreams are kind of just something that's in the back of her mind and they're never going to come true. And so then like when she met Tea Cake, I think that like after a while in that relationship, I think that was like her awakening, her real awakening, whereas she thought she had that at first and then realized that, you know, there was such thing as love. And
I like that. I think there are a lot of parts in the book where they're like you said, like this like awakening. I think that if you've ever read any other books by Kirsten, it's very much like the struggles of like an African American woman, because she is African American, and so a lot of them, I feel like a lot of her writing comes from like a very like deep and like personal place in her own life, and so I thought it was really cool that like throughout the book, it's not really like a self-help book, but there's just like a lot of good things that you can take away, like, especially I don't know, in I feel like sometimes in LDS culture it can feel a little bit stifling, like how Janie's culture, like there's a lot of emphasis on like being a wife and being subservient essentially, and so I think that for me it was really cool because it was more like, topical into my own life.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that question of like the societal attitudes and values that are in the book. I think it was just like filled with those and like everything, and it was just trying to like uncover them and get to the bottom of it and like how wrong a lot of like attitudes and values are, and like seeing it from that like reading about it, you look at it and you're like, that's so wrong. Like nobody should ever be treated like that. When you're in it, you don't always feel that. So I think that it was just like really eye-opening to all of that stuff.
Anyone have anything else they want to add last minute?
Nope.
All right, then anyone like want to write it up, or are we just going to keep rotating it?
I can do the write-up again.
I'll send you guys the URL link.
Perfect.
All right.
Thanks.
All right.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.